Welcome to the fourth JUICE webinar of our series that is organized in collaboration with Europlanet. I am Maarten Roos-Sarot, and I'll be hosting this webinar together with Colin Piper today. So this series is organized together with Olivier Vitas and Claire Valla from the JUICE team at ESA, and with Callum Piper at Europlanet. And we organize these events to talk about JUICE science, but in the larger context. Today, we are going to make a connection between science to be done by JUICE at Ganymede, once we get there, and science to be done at Earth, actually, with SMILE. So SMILE, for those who don't know, is a new mission at ESA mission. SMILE stands for the Solar Wind Magnetosphere-Ionosphere Link Explorer. The spacecraft is actually being put together at this moment as we speak at ESA-CAS. And special about this project is that it is the first 50-50 collaboration with the Chinese Academy of Sciences, the CAS. So it's kind of special project for that as well. Today we have two fabulous speakers with us. The first talk will be given by Pippa Molyneux. Pippa is a planetary scientist at the Southwest Research Institute in the US. Her research focuses on understanding the composition and the surfaces and atmospheres of the icy moons in our solar system with the help of UV spectroscopy. She's also involved in the development of new instrumentation for future planetary missions, and she has helped build and test the UV spectrograph on JUICE, as well as the spectrograph that sits on Europa Clipper. So she's very much in a good place to talk about all these things. Pippa will discuss about how future JUICE observations of the auroral emissions on Ganymede will help us characterize different aspects of the so complex Ganymede system that is a magnetosphere within a magnetosphere, and what we can learn about the magnetosphere of Ganymede, the local magnetic environment, the atmosphere of Ganymede, and all the way down to its interior. Then the second talk today will be by Colin Forsyth. Colin is an associate professor at the UCL Mullard Space Science Laboratory in the UK. His primary research interest is terrestrial magnetospheric dynamics, and he also studies dynamics of the Earth's outer radiation belt and space weather. In 2015, he developed a new technique for identifying different phases in so-called substorms. These are energetic events in the solar wind magnetosphere-ionosphere system. This technique he called SOFI and is now being widely used. And earlier this year, he became the European co-PI on the joint ESA-CAS Smile mission. Colin will talk about SMILE and how the instrumentation observations to be done with SMILE will make visible some of the unseen phenomena in the Earth's magnetosphere, and how this all connects to our understanding of magnetospheric systems in other bodies of the solar system. Each talk will be about 20 minutes, and then, as Callum already mentioned, we'll have time for Q&A. So without further ado, Pippa, you are the first to talk, so the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you, Martin, and thank you for the introduction. Share my screen now. All right. So today I'm going to talk about Ganymede, my favorite moon, and the key target of the JUICE mission. Just have a funny bar in my screen here. So, okay. Oh no, going my way. Okay, I'm going to talk about Ganymede's aurora and how we will study this with JUICE. So Ganymede is a really unique moon. It's the only moon that we're aware of that has its own intrinsically generated internal magnetic field. So other moons can have induced magnetic fields within conductive subsurface oceans, but Ganymede is the only one that we know of that has this kind of permanent magnetic field as well. And so that magnetic field and magnetosphere that's associated with Ganymede is located within a very large magnetosphere of Jupiter. And that's kind of a unique environment, and it's shown in this nice illustration by Jamie Zlay. And one thing that you can see also in this illustration is that where we have these boundaries between magnetic field lines that are closed on both ends to Ganymede and magnetic field lines that are open on one end, then at those boundaries, we see these auroral ovals, very similar to the auroral ovals that we see on the Earth. So as I mentioned, Ganymede is the primary target of JUICE. I'm sure a lot of people in this webinar are very familiar with JUICE, but in case there's anyone new, then JUICE will perform 12 flybys of Ganymede during its tour of the Jupiter system from 2031. They get down to as low as 400-kilometer altitude. And then about 10 years from now, in December 34, JUICE will go into orbit around Ganymede, be the first spacecraft to orbit a moon other than our own moon. And by the end of that orbital phase, we'll be down to altitudes as low as 200 kilometers. So JUICE will really vastly increase the number of observations of Ganymede we have, and the characterization of the aurora we can do is going to greatly increase our understanding of the processes there. So my goal with this talk is to kind of give you some background into what we already know about the aurora, the kinds of studies that we can do with these emissions, and kind of make you look forward to some of the improvements that we'll get once JUICE gets to Ganymede. So just a quick note on some of the geometry of the system and terminology in case anyone is not a moon's person. So Ganymede is tidally locked to Jupiter, which means that the same face of the moon is always facing into the direction of Ganymede's orbital motion. And we call that hemisphere the leading hemisphere. And then the opposite is the trailing hemisphere. The Jovian plasma, so the charged particles that are trapped within Jupiter's magnetosphere, also orbit in the same direction, but they are pulled along with Jupiter's rotation, which is about a 10-hour period, whereas Ganymede takes over 170 hours to rotate. So this plasma is continually overtaking this moon from the trailing hemisphere towards the leading hemisphere. That's just something to bear in mind as we show some of the aurora results a bit later. But going back to kind of the discovery of Ganymede's magnetic field, this magnetic field and magnetosphere was first detected by the Galileo spacecraft. Galileo performed 6 flybys of Ganymede between 1996 and 2000. And from the earliest ones, it was very clear that this magnetosphere was present. So the kind of evidence that was seen by the instruments carried on the spacecraft included very sudden, sharp changes in the magnetic field as they got close to Ganymede, and also an abrupt change in the plasma flow speed as they moved into this region that's protected by Ganymede's magnetosphere. So this image on the right here is showing kind of similar to the schematic I showed in the last page, where the plasma flow is coming from the left to the right, and you can see the blue color is kind of faster plasma that's being pulled around with Jupiter, and then the black region is showing you where Ganymede's magnetosphere is kind of protecting the plasma local to Ganymede. It's slower. So these simulations are based on some of that Galileo flyby data too. And around the same time that the magnetic field and magnetosphere was detected for the first time, the auroral emissions at Ganymede were also detected for the first time, this time by the Hubble Space Telescope. So, sorry, I'm just gonna have a sip of my drink here. In the 1990s, Hall et al. Observed Ganymede's trailing hemisphere using an instrument called the Goddard High Resolution Spectrograph. So here, this is a spectrum rather than an image, but we're seeing 2 oxygen emission lines in the ultraviolet. One's at 130.4 nanometers and one's at 135.6 nanometers. And in between them, there's a reflected solar line, which is very helpful for scaling any background sun and removing that from your auroral emissions. The thing that was really interesting about this observation is the shape of this line at 135.6 nanometers. It has this double peaked structure. If the emissions were evenly spread across Ganymede's disk, we would instead see kind of a Gaussian. So this double peak means that the emissions were coming from 2 separate regions that are spatially separated. And Hall et al. Showed that these were most likely at Ganymede's poles and analogous to auroral ovals on Earth. And then that was confirmed a few years later by Feldman et al. They use a different Hubble instrument, the Space Telescope Imaging Spectrograph, and this is an image at 135.6 nanometers, and they confirmed that, yes, these emissions are located towards the poles. And so, yes, these are UV emissions. Ganymede will also have optical aurora, and they have actually been detected. I'll talk a little bit about them later, but most of the previous observations we have of Ganymede were performed in the UV, and that's simply because of our location in the solar system. We're between the sun and Jupiter. We only ever see the day side from the Earth. And just like you have trouble seeing the Earth's aurora during the day, you would struggle to see Ganymede's optical emissions above the reflected sunlight at those optical wavelengths. So most of these observations that I'll show will be UV observations. Okay, and the emissions are being produced by electrons that are accelerated along Ganymede's magnetic field lines into the atmosphere, which is predominantly O2, so molecular oxygen. And specifically what's happening is these electrons are splitting the O2 molecules into two O atoms, and one of these is excited, and as that relaxes back to a ground state, then it releases a photon of light at very specific wavelengths, including the two UV lines that I just mentioned. And so the brightness of the emission is related to the density of the atmosphere, the O2 density, the electron density, and also a rate coefficient, which is a function of electron energy, and it essentially tells you for a specific atmospheric material and a specific electron energy, how efficient is this process of producing the photons. But these kind of characteristics, the parameters, the atmospheric density and the characteristics of the electron population are not that well constrained at Ganymede. We have to sort of extrapolate from the few flyby observations that we have from Galileo. We don't have any direct measurements of the atmospheric density yet. So if when you read papers analyzing these auroral emissions and trying to kind of figure out the atmospheric density from that, then you'll see kind of large error ranges. And this is something that JUICE will really kind of constrain for us with its exploration of the Ganymede environment. So JUICE carries a comprehensive suite of instruments covering remote sensing, so things like the UVS instrument that I work on, and visible and mid-infrared instruments, in situ instruments that will directly detect particles and waves and fields, and also geophysics instruments that can tell us more about Ganymede's subsurface and interior. So of particular interest for constraining these parameters that I just mentioned that are kind of uncertain, of course, we'll be using UVS to image those emissions, but it will be very interesting and important to have the direct measurements of these particles that are causing the emissions close to Ganymede, and to see if they're consistent with the constraints that we have from Galileo. If they vary over time, we don't have a lot of kind of temporal coverage, so we don't know if these populations might have changed since Galileo. And just seeing how that interaction actually works. And we'll also be able to get direct measurements of the atmosphere for the first time, for example, with the PEP-NIM instrument, which is a neutral mass spectrometer. So as well as looking at the brightness of individual lines, we can learn about Ganymede's atmosphere by looking at the relative brightness of different emission lines. So here I'm showing, again, UV spectra. These are from another Hubble instrument, the Cosmic Origin Spectrograph. And each panel is showing, on the left, there's the spectrum before I've taken off the sunlight, and then on the right is just the remaining spectrum, so just the emissions that are localized to Ganymede after removing that solar component. And even just like looking at these spectra, you can initially see that the leading hemisphere and the trailing hemisphere have different ratios of these two oxygen emission lines. On the leading hemisphere, the ratio that we see is around 2, and that's very consistent with what we would expect to see based on lab studies of electrons impacting O2. So that's consistent with our previous understanding of the atmosphere. But on the trailing hemisphere, we were seeing kind of continual, consistently lower ratios. And the only way to really explain that is if there's other materials present that have like these different rate coefficients. So materials that are more effective at producing the shorter wavelength UV line at 130.4 nanometers rather than this 135.6 nanometer one. And those materials include things like atomic oxygen or water vapor. But these are just kind of averaged over the full hemisphere. Roth et al. Published a study that showed what is happening with this ratio as a function of position on Ganymede's disk, and that really helped to constrain what was going on there. So they looked at images from Hubble's SIS instrument again, comparing the ratio measured if you compare these images in concentric regions, starting from the center of the disk and moving outwards. And what they found is that this emission ratio is always lowest in the center of the disk, and then it kind of gradually increases towards the Ganymede limbs. And the best way to explain that is that there's an atmosphere above the subsolar point, so something sublimated, and that fits best with a sublimated H2O atmosphere that's just present on the day side of Ganymede and focused around this subsolar point. But there's been some kind of questioning of this interpretation. So I mentioned most of our observations have been in the UV. It is possible to look at optical emissions at Ganymede if you look as Ganymede is in the shadow of Jupiter, so not quite behind it from our point of view, but just shadowed enough that we don't see those solar reflected contamination, and we just see optical emissions. So this study was published by Milby et al. Earlier this year. They used Keck to look at these optical aurora. And the reason they wanted to do this is that just as we have this UV ratio we can use to constrain the composition, there's a ratio of 2 visible oxygen lines that you can use that's even more sensitive to the presence of water vapor. So any amount of H2O should make a big decrease in this ratio. But what they saw was that the results were instead consistent with almost entirely O2. So we do expect the sublimated atmosphere to collapse when Ganymede is shaded because the surface cools down. But they argue that this happened faster than they would have expected. So that kind of implies that either the UV interpretation is not quite right, or the calculation, the estimate of how fast this atmosphere collapses is not quite right, which may tell us that we're not quite understanding the thermal properties of the surface, for example. And this is something that JUICE can address very well, because we will be able to get UV and visible measurements of the aurora simultaneously for a start. So we'll be able to see how this brightness ratio compares to the UV brightness ratio at all times. And then for UV, at least, we'll be able to see the day side and the night side. So we'll be able to see, as we move from one to the other, you know, if we go past dawn or dusk, how does that atmosphere composition change? And then even more helpfully, we'll have these direct measurements as we get close to Ganymede with PEP-NIM. So this will really answer this question. And of course, as well as looking at the brightness of aurora, we're very interested in the morphology and the shape and how that varies as well. So the aurora, as I mentioned at the start, they're produced along these open closed field line boundaries at Ganymede. And because of the plasma coming in from the left of this image is always kind of pushing against that trailing hemisphere field, that pushes the location of these boundaries up to higher latitudes on the trailing hemisphere and lower latitudes on the leading hemisphere, which is shown in these comparisons of Hubble images taken at different positions during Ganymede's orbit by Melissa McGrath and others. And so here is shown kind of the average position of the aurora and some models of this open closed field line boundary. They match pretty well. But this is not a constant position, this boundary. As the Jovian magnetosphere rotates, then these boundaries change, the position of the boundaries change. And the reason for that is that Jupiter's rotation axis and magnetic axis are offset by almost 10 degrees. So the angles at which the magnetic fields of Jupiter and Ganymede are kind of interacting, that changes over this rotation period, and it leads to a periodic rocking in the position of those auroral ovals. This is something that was exploited by a really interesting study by Joachim Sauer et al. In 2015. They argued that because of the law of induction, Faraday's law of induction, if there's an ocean present below Ganymede's surface, if it's a conductive ocean, then that would act to reduce the rocking motion. And so they performed carefully timed Hubble observations that would sample different parts of Jupiter's 10-hour rotation period, and they looked at how the aurora actually moved, and they found that, yes, it did rock less than you would expect if there was no ocean present. So that was used to constrain kind of the depth and salinity of the ocean. This is something that, again, JUICE will be able to do in very high, with very high resolution images by the UV spectrograph, and we'll be able to kind of see how this rocking motion actually evolves over time. And compare that to more direct measurements of the induced field, for example, by the magnetometer on JUICE, and also any other constraints on the subsurface from the geophysics instruments, and get kind of really tighter constraints on what's going on beneath Ganymede's surface. So most of the observations we have are ground-based, but we did get a really nice preview of what we might expect to see with JUICE from a Juno flyby of Ganymede a few years ago. So Juno carries a UV spectrograph as well. It's almost identical to the one on JUICE. It's built by the same people and operated by the same team. And so Juno UVS observed Ganymede during this flyby on the 7th of July 2021, getting down to a closest approach altitude of 1,000 kilometers. And this was kind of the best constraint we were able to get so far on the latitudinal extent of the auroral ovals. So they're a lot thinner than you might expect from the Hubble observations, just because we don't have the spatial resolution with Hubble to see this real structure. And it was also the first chance that we had to look at how high they are vertically. So from these observations, we see that they're within about 25 to 50 kilometers of the surface. They're quite low down. And we were able to look at this kind of latitudinal profile. And something that was interesting about this is when we're outside of the open closed field line boundary, so at the high latitudes, the auroral emissions dropped off very sharply, but moving towards the equator, so inside the closed field line boundaries, then we saw more of a gradual decrease in the brightness of the emissions shown by the blue lines in this panel. But we don't know what causes that, if it's something unique to kind of the electron population inside the magnetosphere there, or what's going on. And we don't know if it's always like this, if it changes over time. Is this just something unique to this flyby? With one data set, you can't understand, how these processes are evolving over time. So this is something that JUICE will really excel in, is looking at how these auroral emissions vary with different timescales from seconds and minutes to months and years even across the full mission. And we'll also have this opportunity to do simultaneous UV and in situ measurements to really understand what exactly is it that's determining this kind of structure within the aurora here. So to summarize, JUICE will lead to large increases in our understanding of Ganymede's aurora. And some of the things that I think are particularly important from my UV point of view are the simultaneous UV and visible emission observations, also with in situ measurements to understand where those emissions are being generated and how they're connected to the electron environment. We'll have extensive spatial coverage, so we'll be able to look at leading, trailing hemisphere over time and see how the aurora move and change. And we'll have these observations, spanning a huge range of timescales, allowing us to see, what's kind of more random processes, maybe on short scales, and then like any movement associated with Jupiter's 10-hour period, or even like long-term changes in Jupiter's magnetosphere. For example, if Io is more active and we're having more plasma injected into the system by Io's volcanoes, we don't really know if that affects Ganymede's aurora at all. And just kind of as a transition towards Colin's talk, because he's going to be talking about the Earth, here's a quick comparison between Ganymede and the Earth. So Ganymede's magnetosphere is a lot smaller, you might expect. Ganymede is smaller than the Earth. But the main kind of difference in the shapes of the magnetospheres is due to kind of the energy involved in these interactions. There's a pretty weak interaction between Jupiter's magnetospheric plasma and Ganymede. Although the plasma from Jupiter is moving faster than Ganymede, it's not moving that much faster, it's not that dense, so Ganymede doesn't prove too much of an obstacle to it, whereas at the Earth, the solar wind has to slow down a lot when it reaches the Earth, and it forms this bow shock, which we don't see at Ganymede, and that pushes the magnetosphere there into quite a different shape. So more of this sort of horizontally extended shape, whereas at Ganymede it's more of like a vertical cylinder. And here's just a image of some of the UV aurora at Ganymede and Earth. We're seeing similar processes. We're seeing ovals that they may be at lower latitudes on Ganymede, but these are both oxygen emissions. And there's differences, Earth has more atmospheric gases, it has different wavelengths of aurora, but we do see these oxygen emissions, and the brightness, since the compositions are different, Earth has brighter 130.4 nanometer emissions, and Ganymede has brighter 135.6 nanometer emissions relative to the other line. But the same processes are involved. We're seeing these ovals at the open closed field line boundaries. And I'm looking forward to seeing what Colin can tell me more about this system. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much for this very interesting talk. Let's go straight into Colin's talk, and then we'll have Q&A. So Colin, the floor is all yours.
Can I just remind all of our attendees that please post your questions, either save them for the Q&A, or if you'd like to post them now, then they'll be at the top of the queue when we... it's preferable to us if you use the Q&A function. You'll find that at the bottom toolbar of your Zoom window. But if you put them in the chat, we will do our best to pick them up as well. The risk being in the chat, messages can get lost, whereas in the Q&A, we'll know exactly where they are. So please ask your questions during the talks, and we'll get to them at the Q&A session at the end. Thanks. Over to you, Colin.
Thank you, and thank you, Pippa, for that interesting talk on Ganymede and introducing the ideas of the magnetosphere and aurora that comes from that interaction between the magnetic field of one body with a plasma environment outside of that. Now, in Pippa's talk, she showed some of these wonderful pictures that we've put together of what a magnetosphere looks like. But actually, the magnetosphere is unseen. We can feel it as we pass a spacecraft through it. But actually seeing the magnetic field and seeing the structure of this environment is almost something that we've almost never been able to do before. And in order to understand the interaction between the magnetosphere of any body and everything else that's going on, it would be really great if we could see what was going on, what the shape of the magnetosphere was. So we have these pictures. I mean, these pictures and the idea of a magnetosphere goes back to sort of early theoretical concepts. So this is a paper from Chapman and Farrow in 1931, where they were talking about the interaction of Earth's magnetic field with an ejector coming off of the sun, and how that magnetic field would create this region within that ejector, essentially preventing that ejector from reaching the Earth. And so the idea of the magnetic field protecting us and keeping this stuff away from us was sort of born. But it wasn't until we got out into space, we developed the ideas of the solar wind and this constant stream of matter coming off of the sun and interacting with planetary magnetic fields, that we sort of understood that this magnetosphere was a real thing that was out there all the time, and an object in space. Now, we can't see it. We just can't see these interactions. We have an idea, the magnetic field has to have a certain configuration. We can think about the underlying physics. But if we want to understand what the magnetosphere might look like, we've got to feel it. We've got to put a spacecraft up into space, and we've got to take observations over time. And so if we've got a spacecraft making crossings over time, and this is data from the Themis mission, these are crossings that were identified from the Themis mission over time and published in 2020, we can start to see that if we put all these crossings together, we can get an idea as to what the shape of the magnetosphere, and particularly the edge of the magnetosphere, the magnetopause, might be. But it's very statistical. This system is a dynamic system. It's changing all the time. And when you pass through the magnetopause, you know where the magnetopause was when you pass through it. And that's it. We can try and infer from previous crossings what the shape of the system might be. We might see multiple crossings, so we can understand some of the dynamics, but you're either crossing it or you're not, when you're only feeling the magnetopause crossings with in situ observations. And that's the standard way that we've been able to do this in the past. But a magnetosphere is dynamic. And particularly Earth's magnetosphere, where we're sitting in the solar wind carrying the interplanetary magnetic field with it, and that magnetic field changing all the time, that's going to drive certain dynamics within our magnetosphere. And the most obvious one that Pippa alluded to is when we have reconnection on the day side. So this would have been the leading side, I think. Sorry, I'm trying to remember your coordinate system, Pippa. At Earth, we have the sunward side, and so we have the interplanetary magnetic field coming in, and if it is southward, pointing opposite to the northward pointing magnetic field of the Earth, then we get reconnection on the day side. the magnetic field is then swept over the Earth, reconnects on the night side, and goes through this cyclic process, enabling the magnetic field of the Earth to couple to the solar wind, and driving actually processes down in the ionosphere as well. So we see that the movement of plasma in the ionosphere resulting from this process, this so-called Dungy cycle put forward by Jim Dungy in 1961, where we see this twin cell of convection in the ionosphere being driven by the interaction between the sun and the sun's magnetic field and the Earth's magnetic field. And so we have this link between what's going on in the solar wind with the Earth's magnetic field and ultimately down into the atmosphere and into the ionosphere. And this interaction drives all sorts of dynamics within the system that we now have a better understanding on, as we're able to model this more. We're able to model the underlying physics. We're able to put these into computer simulations. So this is the Vlasiator model, which has been developed by the group in Helsinki over a number of years, where we're now actually able to see some of the intricate dynamics. And this is a relatively quiet time in the magnetosphere. And we can see all of these different things going on, plasma flowing down the tail, plasma flowing around the flanks. All these things are dynamic all the time. And then we get to points where actually, instead of that simple Dungy cycle, we can have day-side reconnection without night-side reconnection. We can have build-up of energy and then release of energy. And this creates a very dynamic system. The processes associated with this energize the plasma within the magnetosphere and ultimately send plasma down into the upper atmosphere, causing the upper atmosphere to glow and causing us to see this brightening of the aurora. So here's the auroral oval seen in UV. So this is taken from the NASA image spacecraft. This is a substorm where we get this global brightening of the auroral oval because we're getting this energy dumped from the magnetosphere, captured from the solar wind interaction, and dumped into the upper atmosphere. So we want to understand all of these interactions. We want to understand how the energy comes into the system. We want to understand how it ends up coming down into the atmosphere, how it's being released. And so the way that we're now planning on doing this is with the new SMILE mission from ESA and the Chinese Academy of Sciences. So as Martin mentioned, SMILE is the Solar Wind Magnetosphere-Ionosphere Link Explorer. It's this joint mission. It's 50-50 between the European Space Agency and the Chinese Academy of Sciences. This is our first time doing a 50-50 mission. There have been previous involvements between ESA and CAS, particularly in the cluster and double star missions to study Earth's magnetosphere using in situ observations. But this is our next mission to study Earth's magnetosphere, and it's this fully 50-50 joint mission. It's actually a crossover between X-ray astronomy and heliophysics. So we've learned from the X-ray astronomy community, and particularly some of the observations of the outer planets and observations of distant objects as well, and strange signals within the data. And so we've been able to use some of that, and we're now developing these ways of being able to see something entirely new. Our mission objectives, we have these three main mission objectives, which are to understand the fundamental modes of day-side solar wind and magnetosphere interactions, understanding what defines the substorm cycle, and also when we have these large eruptions from the sun, these coronal mass ejections, seeing what the difference is between the storms that arise from those and the substorms which we have on a more day-to-day basis. The SMILE spacecraft is a 2.6-ton, 3-axis stabilized spacecraft. This is something slightly different for us when studying the plasma of the magnetosphere. Typically, we have spinning spacecraft. This is going to be a 3-axis stabilized spacecraft, and that's because our primary goal is imaging rather than the measurement of the plasma itself. The platform is being provided by the Chinese Academy of Sciences and is just about to arrive at ESA ESTEC for testing. The payload module was provided by ESA and did arrive at ESTEC earlier this year. We're starting to go through the integration process and the final testing as we prepare for launch. Launch is to be from French Guiana on a Vega C, hopefully towards the end of next year. And for those of you who are following launch news, the Vega C actually returned to flight yesterday, and that's a big milestone for us. That's something that we've been looking forward to so that we know that our launcher is there and ready. When SMILE launches, we will be getting up into a 5,000 kilometer by 121,000 kilometer altitude polar orbit. And that's going to look something like this. So this is SMILE coming up here, coming out of the magnetosphere, spending a lot of time in the magnetosheath, but being able to look down on the northern hemisphere and on the magnetosphere itself. Just for context, for those of you aware of some of the other Earth missions, this orbit down here is the NASA Themis spacecraft, which we hope will be continuing to operate through next year and on into the future, so we'll have collaborations with them. So the instruments that we have on board. We've talked about the UV observations from JUICE. SMILE will have a UV camera on board. This is being led by the National Space Science Center in China. It's a UV imager with a 10 by 10 degree field of view, going to be looking in the 160 to 180 nanometer band. So we're going to be looking at LBH aurora coming up from the Earth. We're still working on what cadence we will be able to achieve with the instrument. Being in orbit of Earth, we're actually able to have quite a lot of telemetry, and we're pushing what we can do with this instrument and hoping that we might get up to 30-second cadence images coming down from the spacecraft, possibly even higher. Now, unlike the images on JUICE, this is a single waveband imager, so we're not going to be able to do the spectroscopy side of things, but we are going to be able to see a global view over long durations of what the auroral oval looks like. And if we couple that with observations from the ground using ground-based instruments, either radars or ground-based auroral cameras, we'll be able to fill in some of that information about the spectroscopy as well. So this is just a sort of couple of simulations as to what we might see from from SMILE, from the ESA-CAS Smile mission, and what we saw before from the NASA IMAGE mission. So IMAGE operated from 2000 to 2005 and gave us these global auroral views, but it was only in an orbit going up to around about, I think it was 14 Earth radii or so. Possibly lower, whereas our orbit is taking us up over 21 Earth radii. And what that means is that IMAGE tended to orbit the Earth once every 12 to 14 hours. We're going to orbit the Earth once every 48 hours or so. So if I run these again, so in the same time that we are passing through one of our orbits, IMAGE would have passed through 2 or 3 of its orbits, maybe even 4 of its orbits. And that means that we have quite a lot of time where we're not seeing the auroral oval from IMAGE, whereas the SMILE orbit means we're going to have these very long period observations of the auroral oval, which means we're going to be able to do fantastic science imaging the aurora during storms and during substorms, having these long periods where we can see what's going on again and again and again. Now, the UV imager, we've done that sort of thing before. It's going to produce this new science, this long-term observation is going to be great for us. But the really exciting new instrument that we've never flown before is this soft X-ray imager. And this is coming out of the University of Leicester. Now, images from missions such as XMM have a very small field of view and are enormous long telescopes. This imager is using a new technique which uses slumped micropore lobster eye optics. So this is a technique that was suggested in the 1970s that allows you to have a very short focal length, our focal length here being of the order of 30 centimeters, but also a very large field of view. So we're going to be looking at a 15 by 26 degree field of view. It's a photon counting telescope, which is something new for us in magnetospheric physics. We are going to measure every single photon which hits this instrument, and the time of arrival, where that arrives on the CCD, and the energy of that photon is going to be transmitted down to the ground. So we're going to have to integrate this up. We're going to have lists of photon arrivals, and by integrating those up, we're expecting that we'll be producing one X-ray image with a cadence of around about 5 to 10 minutes, but have the potential to go and change that temporal resolution if we've got lots of data coming back, lots of counts into the instrument. And this instrument, this is key, it's going to enable us to see the location of the magnetopores. Now, the way this works is by considering the stuff in the solar wind that we often forget about. We think of the solar wind as being a stream of protons predominantly coming off of the sun, but there's also a stream of heavier ions coming off that are very highly charged, things like ion 6 and ion 7, where we can strip out almost all of the electrons from those ions, and they travel through the solar system with the solar wind and are going to reach close to the Earth. And at the same time, Earth's atmosphere expands out into space. So we've got the charged neutrals and these charged ions, and then the neutral atmosphere, and these two things are going to be able to interact. So we've got our neutral atom on the right and our ion on the left. As they come into contact with one another, then we can have this charge exchange process where the ion will actually steal the electron from the neutral particle. The new ion disappears off, and that stolen electron ends up in a high energy layer of the ion. It's going to want to dump that energy, which it does by emitting an X-ray photon. And so that is the X-ray photons that we're going to see. We're looking for this solar wind charge exchange process. And thankfully, because of the magnetosphere and the way that particles pile up in the region between the magnetosphere and the bow shock, we're going to have enough density of these particles and of the neutral particles coming off of the Earth that we're going to be able to see these X-ray photons emitted from this region. So this is a simulation as to what we might see. On the left-hand side, we have an MHD simulation, or the emissivity from an MHD simulation. Our field of view sits within this box, so I've also shown just the emissivity within that box. And then this emissivity has been passed through an instrument simulator so that we can get some idea as to the X-ray data that we might expect from the SMILE mission. And you can see as the magneto sheath passes into the field of view, we've got the magnetopause here where we go from dark to light. We're seeing in that same region this emission of X-ray photons that's allowing us to track where that thing is over time. As well as the imaging instruments, we are going to be measuring the plasma local to the spacecraft as well, so that we can put the observations that we're seeing in context of the dynamics that's associated with them. So we'll have a light ion analyzer that's going to tell us about the conditions in the magneto sheath, so the density, the speed of and energy of the ions that are coming through, as well as a magnetometer to allow us to understand, are we looking at southward field, northward field within that region, as well as looking at the dynamics close to the magnetopause as we look for things like flux transfer events. As well as SMILE, as a mission, we've been working very closely with other instruments and other projects around the world. Since the 1960s, we've had this development and deployment of ground-based instrumentation, particularly in the Northern Hemisphere, where we've got chains of magnetometers, we've got incoherent and coherent scatter radars, we've got all-sky cameras, rheometers, all sorts of instruments that allow us to understand what the ionosphere is doing. And by coupling that with the observations of the dynamics of the magnetopause and looking at the global variations of the aurora that we're going to see from SMILE, we're going to be able to fully attack the links between the solar wind, the magnetosphere, and the ionosphere to further our understanding of this fully coupled system. As well as instruments on the ground, we are going to have other instruments flying in space. So SMILE will be in an orbit like this, taking it out into the magnetosheath, where we'll be able to see down into where the magnetopause is, see down into the Northern Hemisphere aurora, and measure the plasma in the magnetosheath. At the same time, we'll have spacecraft observations from the NASA MMS spacecraft, Themis spacecraft as well, as they pass into the magnetotail and see the dynamics in that region, all pass through the magnetopause, allowing us to actually compare our determination of where the magnetopause was with true in situ observations as well, so that we can confirm that what we're seeing and our interpretation of that data is correct. So the current status of the mission, we are in the final build and test phase of the spacecraft. We have a launch contract which has been signed, so we do have an agreed launch. The testing will take place over the next 6 months or so, and the spacecraft will be made ready for launch. We are still developing the data product pipelines, and particularly things like the quick look plots, so that we'll be able to see the data as it comes down. Our aim is for a launch at the end of next year, starting operations early 2026. We will be embargoing the data, but quick look data will be available, and people, if they're interested in looking at this and seeing the science that we'll be doing, are strongly encouraged to reach out to the Smile team to collaborate with them. So that's it from me. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Colin. Thank you so much, Pippa, for your wonderful talks. Very, very interesting and informative. So let's have some Q&A. Are there any questions online, either through the chat? I don't see anything through the chat or the Q&A box, or somebody who wishes to just say their questions by voice. I don't see anything
yet in the chat,
but otherwise I prepare some questions while listening. So,
we have a raised hand.
Has a raised hand. Philippe, we can unmute you. Yes, let's see.
I've allowed you to talk, so you can unmute yourself, Philippe, if you would like to ask a question. If not, and that was an accidental hand, please let us know.
Can you hear me?
Yes, there's some background though, but
because I'm in a big space. My question is on Ganymede. The aurora produced at Ganymede, are they produced by electrons of the same energy as at Earth, or higher energy? Because you have higher energy in the magnetosphere. So could you tell us about the energy of the electron produced in the aurora?
Yes, so at Ganymede, the electrons producing the aurora are thought to be energies between about 75 electron volts and 300 electron volts. I am not really sure what the energies at the Earth are. If anyone else knows that and would like to jump in with a comparison. Great.
Well, at the Earth, the excitation energies are going to be lower than that. We're going to be in the tens of EV. I don't think we're seeing a dissociation process. We're seeing mostly the energization of the neutral particles. But the particles coming down to start with are going to start with energies of up to a keV. And so there's an energy cascade process that goes on above the ultimate emission line, where we see ionization processes happening, particles losing energy, or a cascade of electrons coming down, eventually reaching the energy of having insufficient energy to ionize particles, and so creating that emission instead. So I'd be interested to know, sort of the same as Philippe, is it that the particles in the Jupiter system are actually starting off at that keV energy within the plasma sheet or the plasma environment, and you're still seeing that energy cascade?
So in the magnetosphere, the Jovian magnetosphere local to Ganymede, the energies are mostly at lower. The electrons are mostly lower energies, so like 20 eV is kind of the background energy level there, and then the electrons are being accelerated within Ganymede's magnetosphere to the higher energies of like a few hundred eV to generate the auroral emissions. But yeah, we don't have a great kind of coverage of the magnetosphere with in situ instruments, so it'll be interesting to see what energy distributions we see with JUICE once we have these in situ measurements there.
Okay, very good. So when we talked before, some time ago before this the webinar, so I was asking about, and I will just ask it again. So how about the X-ray observations? So that's new for the Earth. Could you comment about, could you do that somewhere else in the solar system on other planets? I think that was tricky.
So yeah, I think it is tricky. I mean, it might be more feasible moving inwards. So you might see similar sort of things at Venus. You've still got a shocked plasma in that region. I don't think you would see a similar thing at Mercury, because you need that combination of a neutral atmosphere which is expanding out into space, and you need the high charge state heavy ions coming in as well, because it's those heavy ions that are giving you that X-ray emission as they capture an electron from the neutral particles. Now, at Earth, we're probably very lucky that we've got sufficient density of those parts. I mean, remember that the heavy ions are making up a very small fraction of the solar wind. And so the further you go out, the number of heavy ions that you're going to have, or the density of heavy ions that you're going to have, is going to drop off. You've also got much bigger magnetospheres in terms of Jupiter and Saturn's magnetospheres, just in terms of their ultimate size being much bigger. So I'm going to assume, although I don't have the evidence to back this up, but I would assume that the exosphere of those planets, so the atmosphere that leaks out into space, by the time it reaches the edge of that magnetosphere, is going to be much, much weaker as well, simply because it's expanded out into a much bigger volume. So it may be tricky to do this at the outer planets, but particularly Venus having a very dense atmosphere to start with, might have a denser exosphere. As long as we're still getting that I think we need the shocking of the solar wind plasma to give us a magnetosheath where the density of the ions go up, but it may be that Venus would be a prime target for this sort of thing sometime in the future.
But there would be heavyish ions inside the Jupiter's magnetosphere system, right? Because there's heavy, well, I don't know if there's heavy enough, but I mean, there's sulfur in the system because that's spit out by Io. I'm not sure whether that, could,
So I think the question would be, can you get it to a sufficiently ionized state?
Right.
Because you need it to be, you need to be capturing an electron and having it go from the highest energy in the ion to pretty much the lowest energy in order to have that, KeV type energy discarded to give you an X-ray photon of that energy. So for iron, not ion, iron, we're expecting, or we know that energy is almost a KeV. And so we can see very distinctly those lines, and that's going to be that emission. So again, I've not studied it in detail. I would understand that in principle, if you have the heavy ions and you have enough neutral particles, then you might see some emission, but they do need to be heavily ionized so that your transition energy is going to be up in the KeV type range.
Okay. Thank you. I see that Philippe Escobar has raised his hand again. Philippe, do you wish to, if you can still unmute yourself if you want.
Maybe to add to Colin, the first solar wind charge exchange that was observed at a comet with an X-ray astronomy mission. And people were not expecting that. And it was the same phenomena, ions from the sun coming to the comet and interacting with the exosphere of the comet. So we should be able to see that also at other comets. And in fact, as a secondary target, we have comet. If we have a nice comet, passing by, and we can point the instrument to it, we may be able to do that also with SMILE then.
Okay. That's a nice little thing. Yeah, that's good to know. Hopefully we get a bright comet in the coming years. Yeah. Any other questions from the audience online? I don't see anything for now. So Philippa, in terms of the Europa Clipper connection, with Clipper is obviously focused on Europa. So I don't know, is this going to do any Ganymede connection? Is there any UV observation connection there or not at all?
Well, so although Europa Clipper is definitely focused on the Europa science, the mission will be performing flybys of Ganymede. We will at least get calibration data. Hopefully we'll get some science observations as well. We don't know yet how much we'll be able to observe, but there will be opportunities. If we're allowed to observe, we will.
Okay. I was wondering about that. Okay. And then let's see, in the meantime, any questions? We are on the top of the hour. So I don't know, anybody in the audience wants to ask something? Still, then in that case, perhaps we close the session as we are on the hour.
Perfectly on time.
Perfectly on time. So thank you so much, Pippa. Thank you so much, Colin, for being here with us today and sharing your science and making the connection between juice and smile in this case. It's really good to see that.